There are places in the world that carry the weight of absolute evil. Places where darkness is not merely the absence of light, but the presence of something far worse. This is the story of a bunker buried deep in the forests of Poland. A bunker that held secrets the Nazis took to their graves. Or at least tried to. It was the winter of 1979. The Cold War was at its peak. Tensions between East and West kept the world teetering on the brink of the abyss. But in the silent forests of Poland, something far older was about to resurface. 3 forestry workers, Marek, Józef, and Piotr, were conducting a routine inspection when they noticed something strange. A depression in the ground, covered by decades of vegetation and snow. Józef, the oldest of the 3, was only 12 years old when the war ended. He still remembered the whispers, the stories his father hushed about secret Nazi installations hidden in the forests. "Don't touch that," Józef said, his voice trembling. "You don't know what might be down there." But curiosity, that terrible and irresistible force, had already taken hold of the younger ones. They began to dig, and what they found would change their lives forever. After hours of work, they uncovered a rusty metal hatch. Nazi symbols were still vaguely visible beneath decades of corrosion. The door was locked from the inside. Think about that for a moment. Locked from the inside. With improvised tools, they forced their way in. The metal groaned in protest, as if begging to remain closed. And then, the smell. Anyone who has been near a place that has been closed for decades knows that musty, decaying odor. But this was different. It was a chemical smell. Sweetish, nauseating. It was the smell of preserved death. Marek went down first, his flashlight cutting through the absolute darkness. The concrete steps were damp, covered in a viscous substance he preferred not to identify. 20 steps. 30. 40. How deep had the Nazis built this facility? At the bottom of the stairs they found a corridor. The walls were of raw concrete stained by something dark that dripped from the ceiling. Along the corridor, doors, each marked with numbers and symbols they couldn't fully decipher. But there was one word they all recognized. A word that made Józef's blood run cold. Lebensborn. For those who don't know, Lebensborn was the Nazi program for the selective breeding of human beings. One of the darkest chapters of an era already plunged into darkness. But this was no ordinary Lebensborn facility. This was something else. They opened the first door. The room was filled with files. Thousands of documents piled up, many already deteriorated by dampness. But some were still legible. Medical reports, photographs, letters. And then, Piotr found something that made his heart stop. A photograph of children, dozens of them, all under 5 years old, all with the same empty gaze, as if something fundamental had been ripped from their souls. On the back of the photo, a date, January 23, 1945. 2 weeks before the Soviet army arrived in that region. What happened to these children? The second room was a laboratory. Rusty medical equipment was scattered everywhere. Surgical tables, instruments that looked more like torture devices than medical tools, and bottles, hundreds of glass bottles lined up on shelves. Marek approached one of them, wiping away the layer of dust with his sleeve. Inside the jar, something floated in a yellowish liquid. He recoiled, his flashlight falling to the floor. Józef and Piotr rushed to him, and when they saw what was in that jar, neither of them would ever speak of it again in detail. But Józef, years later, before his death, said only one thing to his grandson. There were things down there that weren't entirely human. At the end of the corridor, they found the rooms. Small cells, each with a metal bed and a single word engraved on the wall. Mutter. Mother, in German. In one of the rooms, Piotr found a diary. The pages were stained but still legible. It was the diary of a young woman, a German woman who had been brought to that place in 1943. The first entries were full of hope. She believed she was participating in something grand, something that would help create a superior race. But as the months passed, the tone changed. "They inject us with substances every day," she wrote in March 1944. "The other women are changing. Their eyes no longer seem human. The children born here are not right. They don't cry. They just watch." The last entry was from December 1944. "They're going to evacuate the facility. They said they're going to clean up the evidence. I know what that means. I'm writing this in the hope that someone, someday, will know the truth." The diary entry ended there. At the end of the corridor was one last door, heavier than the others, sealed with bolts that took half an hour to open. When they finally managed to open it, the silence deepened even further. The room was large, circular. In the center, there was a structure that looked like a well, but it didn't go down. It went up. A complex ventilation system that led nowhere. The pipes were all blocked with concrete. Around the well, there were chains, dozens of them, fixed to the floor with iron rings. And on each chain a small child's shoe. Josef began to pray. Piotr vomited. Marek just stood there staring, unable to process what he was seeing. And then they heard it. A sound, coming from above, from the blocked pipes. A tapping, faint, rhythmic, as if something, or someone, was on the other side. They ran. They didn't look back. They didn't hesitate. They climbed those steps faster than they had ever run in their lives. When they emerged back into the forest, the sun was setting, but the daylight had never seemed so welcome. Josef immediately contacted the authorities. And this is where the story gets even stranger. When the officers arrived, the bunker had been sealed again, with fresh concrete. Someone during those few hours had completely filled the entrance with tons of concrete, and none of the three men had seen or heard anyone. Official investigations were carried out, but the records remain classified to this day. The Polish government declared the area contaminated and prohibited any access. Marek never spoke of that day again. He died in 1995, taking his secrets to the grave. Piotr developed chronic insomnia and spent the rest of his life afraid of the dark. Josef lived to be 89, but every time someone mentioned the war, he would just shake his head and whisper, "You don't know. You can't know. Some things must remain buried." But the truth is that even buried, even sealed, even forgotten by time, the shadows of war never truly disappear. They just wait, in the dark, where they always were. If you know someone who lived through those times, who survived those horrors, embrace that person. Listen to their stories, because soon there will be no one left to tell them, and the shadows will remain only as whispers in the wind.